thank you for your work on Canada's Online Streaming Act and your consideration of a Section 301 investigation.
Canada has long discriminated against certain industries in my district.
If Canada is brought back into discussions, will the U.S. ask them to change their tariff rate quota for Chinese EVs?
Canada's market manipulation and unfair treatment of U.S. producers is still evident.
We've been violating CUSMA for at least 5 years, folks. Since Donald Trump began tariffing Canada, Canadians have been told one narrative. Donald Trump is bad, and he is violating our trade agreement. Canada is just responding. Now, something has always felt a bit off with that narrative, and that's because there is. And today, we are going to bring you proof. Not from Canadian sources, but from American sources, and from the CUSMA agreement itself. Not only are we going to show you that the narrative is false, but that Canada was the first one to actually violate the CUSMA agreement, and do it repeatedly. This blows up the entire narrative that Mark Carney would have you believe. Let's take a look. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm bringing you to a CBC article posted on April 23rd, 2026. Carney says lifting U.S. liquor ban depends on Trump, ending assault on steel, autos, and lumber. Prime Minister Mark Carney said Thursday that the provincial ban on U.S. liquor could end quickly if the Americans bend on the tariffs that have pummeled key sectors in this country like steel, autos, and forest products. Carney said the provinces have barred American beer, wine, and spirits because U.S. President Donald Trump launched a trade war that has crippled certain industries, and there's no public appetite for a policy change until the White House delivers some relief. So, while we have a industry on the verge of collapse in Windsor, in Quebec, and across Canada in terms of the mold, tool, and die industry, Mark Carney wants to barter with booze. Great idea, Mr. Carney. This is usually something that you throw the Hail Mary of at the end of negotiations when you've tried everything else. But that's not what he's doing. But let's go to that press conference.
Hi, Graham Richardson, CTV, Prime Minister. Just back to the bourbon ban. Last time I checked...
Was he? Wait, yeah, go ahead.
Well, last time I checked, Mr. Ford has a fair amount of control over the LCBO, even though I appreciate it's independent. But you told him to cool it on the ad that caused a lot of trouble. What if this alcohol thing...
And how did that work? Did he listen?
Yeah. But what if this alcohol thing...
I was right, by the way.
Well, what if this alcohol thing becomes more than an irritant? Look,
you know what's an irritant? Yeah. 50% tariff on steel, 50% tariff on aluminum, 25% tariff on automobiles, all the tariffs on forest products. Those are more than irritants. Those are violations of our trade deal.
Time out. Number one, these are all tariffs that have increased under your watch, Mr. Carney. These are all tariffs that have increased after you told everybody, you boasted that you would be able to handle Donald Trump, that you would be able to negotiate better than anyone with Donald Trump, that you've worked with Donald Trump, that you understand Donald Trump, and that you would get a deal with Donald Trump. So that's number one. Number two, you say that these are all violations of the trade agreement. Let's talk about violations of the trade agreement, shall we? Ladies and gentlemen, said trade agreement, the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, or CUSMA, or USMCA, or any other way you would like to arrange these acronyms, but the agreement is the same no matter who you're talking to. So, we want to go to the first section that we're going to talk about. This is Article 2.3, National Treatment. Each party shall accord national treatment to the goods of another party in accordance with Article 3 of the GATT 1994, including its interpretive notes. And to this end, Article 3 of the GATT 1994 and its interpretive notes are incorporated into and made part of this agreement. Article 22.4, Non-discriminatory treatment and commercial considerations. Each party shall ensure that each of its state-owned enterprises, when engaging in commercial activities, accords to a good or service supplied by an enterprise of another party or country, as this is what the agreement is about, treatment no less favorable than it accords to a like good or a like service supplied by enterprise of the party, of any other party, or of a non-party. Why am I showing you these things? Well, because here's the thing. Mr. Carney, in that CBC article, has said, listen, we'll deal with the alcohol issue once you commit to talking about the tariffs. And he's trying to say that Donald Trump has violated the CUSMA agreement by putting these tariffs on. Well, here's the problem. If you read that, that means that Canada has also violated CUSMA. And we violated it by pulling these products off the shelves. What that essentially says, folks, is that any party that is accepting goods from any other country has to treat the goods coming in from another country the same, at least the same, as it treats its own domestic goods if it's run by a state enterprise. Well, a state enterprise, at least in Ontario, would be the LCBO, and every other province has the corresponding liquor board. So, because these liquor boards have actually pulled the American products off the shelves and left the Canadian products on the shelves, it is not treating the American products equally. So, for Mr. Carney to say, well, they violated the agreement. Well, you also violated the agreement. And for him to say, well, it's not me, it's the provinces. What happened to Team Canada? What happened to the summit? Give me a break. When virtually all the provinces, except for a couple, are doing the same thing, you're going to argue that that's not coordinated? But we're not done there, folks. Because this is just the most recent example. We actually have to go back to right after President Biden took office to look at the other violation of CUSMA that Canada actually made. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a complaint filed by the United States on Canada for violating CUSMA, and this is related to the dairy provisions. Now, here's the issue. They're basically saying that, listen, under Article 3, Canada cannot limit access to an allocation to its processors when administering an allocated TRQ, or tariff rate quota. So basically, this comes into play in where it comes to supply management. What this means is, during the last CUSMA negotiation, the United States negotiated in good faith access to the Canadian market when it came to Canadian dairy. And what Canada did is, sure, yeah, we'll give you access to our market, no problem with that. So what ended up happening is Canada said, all right, so in order for you to access the Canadian market, you have to access these few companies that are Canadian companies, and they will have the option to buy from you. And because there was no quote-unquote incentive for those Canadian companies to buy from the American dairy farmers, guess what happened? They didn't. So the U.S. is saying, well, wait a minute, you're rigging this so our dairy farmers actually don't have access to your market. So this is where this complaint came from. Now, what was the result of this complaint? Right here. For the reasons set forth above, the panel finds that Canada's practice of reserving TRQ pools exclusively for the use of processors is inconsistent with Canada's commitment in Article 3 of the treaty to not, quote-unquote, limit access to an allocation to its processors. So what ended up happening is an independent panel reviewed this, reviewed the complaint by the United States, reviewed Canada's response, and reviewed CUSMA, and said Canada violated CUSMA. And said, you got to fix it. So what Canada then did is it said, oh, okay, so what we'll do is we will expand the market access to a few more companies and a few more types of companies. But it didn't fix the underlying issue of allowing the American dairy farmers access to the Canadian market. Now, this is not me saying, hey, let's bring in loads of Canadian dairy into the Canadian market and flood our market and put our dairy farmers out of business. No. What I'm looking at this is from a completely objective standpoint, where if you're negotiating in good faith, then you need to operate in good faith. But that's not really what happened here. So after Canada made those adjustments, the U.S. filed another complaint. And because they had diversified their market access just enough, despite it having the same results, another panel said, well, yeah, Canada's technically complying with the agreement. But the problem is they're not complying with the spirit of agreement. And this has been one of the main problems that the U.S. has had with Canada and CUSMA. This is what we're learning. And it doesn't stop there. Article 19.3, Customs and Duties. No party shall impose customs, duties, fees, or other charges on or in connection with the importation or exportation of digital products transmitted electronically between a person of one party and a person of another party. For greater certainty, paragraph 1 does not preclude a party from imposing internal taxes, fees, or other charges on a digital product transmitted electronically, provided that those taxes, fees, or charges are imposed in a manner consistent with this agreement. 19.4, non-discriminatory treatment of digital products. No party shall accord less favorable treatment to a digital product created, produced, published, contracted for, commissioned, or first made available on commercial terms in the territory of another party, or to a digital product of which the author, performer, producer, developer, or owner is a person of another party than it accords to other like digital products. What it is saying is that, listen, if you're going to have a digital service provider like, say, Amazon Prime or Netflix or Disney Plus or something like that, you can't treat that in your country any different than you would any other company in your region, and that you cannot just levy taxes or fees on that. That's what that means. This is where the digital service tax beef came from. Canada was violating CUSMA again. And Donald Trump and the US, they weren't being big bad meaties when they said you got to take it off. What they were saying is, you need to comply with the agreement. We signed in good faith. That's what they were saying. So Canada was forced to back down from that. Now, the other thing about this is Canada already violated this when we implemented Bill C-18. Remember C-18? C-18, where it was requiring Facebook and Google, they were having to pay a ton of money, hundreds of millions of dollars, or roughly 5% of their revenue in Canada, in order to actually be in Canada. That's what that was. That violates Section 19 of CUSMA. And that was before Donald Trump took office. That bill took forever to get through the House of Commons. And the U.S. was just watching this move and move and move and move. So the U.S. was watching this actually come through the House of Commons, and it was violating CUSMA. So are we going to sit here and pretend that Canada had no role whatsoever in what is going on right now in the trade war? Because we've been violating CUSMA for at least 5 years, folks. You can have a discussion on whether Donald Trump is violating CUSMA yourself. And that's a reasonable discussion. Donald Trump is not blameless on this. Donald Trump should not have put tariffs on Canada. And it's costing Canadians jobs. And he should take them off. But we can't just think of this as a black and white relationship, as Canada is always innocent and the U.S. is always the bad guy. Because we were doing this under the Joe Biden administration. So what? Are we going to equate Joe Biden to Donald Trump now? Well, mainstream media and Mark Carney won't be doing that, will they? But let's take a look at this testimony by Ambassador Jameson Greer from the United States when he was in Congress the other day.
Thank you for your work on Canada's Online Streaming Act and your consideration of a Section 301 investigation. It is very critical for our American creators because our industry generates over $2 trillion in economic activity, including more than $33 billion in wages in California. And policies like the Online Streaming Act risk shifting jobs and investments out of the U.S. and into Canada.
Specific to autos, which have been, greatly rebalanced, will USMCA economic security discussions include ways to address subsidized Chinese autos? And if Canada is brought back into discussions, will the U.S. ask them to change their tariff rate quota for Chinese EVs?
Well, I think that if the Mexicans and the Canadians want to have preferential access into the U.S. market, they need to make sure that they're controlling their own economic borders. and that includes with respect to subsidized autos coming from China or anywhere else for that matter. So we are focused on this. Each of these countries have their sovereignty and they can decide what they want to do. Mexico has already independently taken steps to raise tariffs on various items from Vietnam and China. We think that's a meaningful step and we look forward to their further alignment.
The top trade issue in my district in northern New York 24, is the relationship between the U.S. and Canada. And Canada is a top market for my district. However, Canada has long discriminated against certain industries in my district, and that is what I want to focus on today. I got a couple quick things, but let's start with dairy, and we've talked about this before. As you recall, probably my district is the 5th largest dairy producing district in the entire United States. For years, Canada has rigged their system to prevent U.S. dairy producers from fair access to Canada's markets. This year's National Trade Estimate report, as every year's report details, Canada's market manipulation and unfair treatment of U.S. producers is still evident. The U.S. has fought for years to gain access to the Canadian dairy market, and yet Canada continues to violate USMCA and the spirit of its dairy commitments. Have you and your team raised these issues with our Canadian counterparts thus far, and have they been constructive in helping all of us resolve this issue with our friend to the north?
We have raised it repeatedly and frequently over the past year. Our Canadian counterparts have indicated as a general matter they're happy to talk to us about adjustments to USMCA and different things like that, but they have made no commitments on this front at this time.
Well, that's disappointing. So let's shift to wine, another issue detailed in the National Trade Estimate. Every Canadian province, with the exception of Alberta and Saskatchewan, has ceased distribution of U.S. wine and liquor products, including Ontario to the north. This is distorting the market, causing immense harm to our wine producers in the district. And have you and your team raised this issue as well with our Canadian counterparts? And have they been trying to help us? Have they been constructive in this issue, much like with the dairy issue?
Well, it's at the provincial level, right? So we hear from the federal government of Canada, well, it's the provinces, and then we do have 2 provinces who don't have this. That being said, I think we're kind of at the end of our rope in just asking for them to do this. Think about it this way. There are 2 countries that have retaliated economically against the United States in the past year, the People's Republic of China and Canada. So that's kind of the company that they're running in. So my sense is there may have to be an enforcement action to deal with this issue on wine and spirits in Canada.
Canada severely restricts imports of bulk fresh fruits and vegetables. Have you and your team raised this issue with our Canadian counterparts, and where are they with this issue as well?
We thought this would be an easy one for them to fix. They've refused to fix it. It's in the National Trade Estimate. It has been for a long time. It's one of those crazy things when you hear that exists. People say, oh, well, Canada, they're our best friends. But then they do things like this where you can't ship fruit if it's in a package above a certain size. It doesn't even make economic sense.
So, Ambassador, as we approach the USMCA review in just under 2 months, I wanted to know what you were doing specifically to finally stop the continued offshoring of these jobs and ensure workers finally see meaningful pay increases.
We've initiated Section 301 investigations in Mexico and Canada, both on forced labor issues as well as structural overcapacity with respect to Mexico.
This is in the United States, and there's going to be some bias on that side as well. So let's just make sure we get that out front. But in looking at this, they're calling out Canada for violating the USMCA. Or CUSMA. They're calling it out for violating it in terms of the way that we're restricting products from coming in, that we're denying market access for Americans. We're taxing digital services via the Online Streaming Act. We were going to tax them again with the digital services tax. So you also have the Americans concerned with products coming into North America by way of forced labor. This is a problem. And if only Mark Carney and the Liberal government had a list of all of the grievances that the Americans had with us when it came to trade. Oh, wait, there is. Would you like to see it? Because you're about to. Ladies and gentlemen, here is the list. 2026 National Trade Estimate Report on Foreign Trade Barriers. This is a document that has a list of all of the irritants that the United States has with regard to trade for every single country that it trades with. Here's the first page. Now, I'm not going to read through everything. This is just to show you that there is this page. There's this page, and this talks about the dairy and supply management irritation that's in there. Here's another one. This talks about the milk classes. This talks about ministerial exemptions. This talks about wine, beer, and spirits, energy, regulation, approval of aircraft. Now, not all of these I agree with, folks, but the point is here's all of the irritants that the U.S. actually has. So you have compositional standards for cheese, zero plastic waste agenda, government procurement. Now, this is kind of rich coming from the United States because they have a Buy America policy, but then they complain that we actually have a Buy Canadian policy. Service barriers, audiovisual services, online streaming. This is where they're talking about Bill C-18 essentially. You may not know this, but this is why this actually violates CUSMA. The Online Streaming Act passed in April 2023. Almost 3 years ago, amended the Broadcasting Act to give the CRTC authority to impose conditions on the operation of online streaming platforms. CRTC regulations issued in June 2024 require certain streaming services to contribute annually 5% of their Canadian revenues to support the Canadian broadcasting systems beginning in the broadcast year 2024 to 2025. The rules include criteria that, based on available information, may effectively exclude Canadian streaming services from the new obligations. So what this says is that companies like Bell, who own Crave, they don't actually have to contribute that 5% to the Canadian broadcasting system. But if you're an American, you do. Remember that clause in CUSMA that says you basically have to treat foreign the same as you treat domestic. It's in the spirit of free trade, right? And it's to ensure that we're all playing in the same sandbox. Digital services taxation, obviously that's a problem. And then, comes to labor. So let's take a look at that one. Canada has adopted measures intended to stop the importation of products produced using forced labor. However, it does not appear that Canada is effectively enforcing its forced labor import prohibition, meaning goods made with forced labor may be able to enter and compete in Canada's market. That's a big issue, folks. Now, this is all not to say that the U.S. doesn't have their issues with CUSMA, and they may be violating CUSMA with these tariffs. That's a separate discussion. But what we do need to have a discussion about is that, remember when the United States actually filed a complaint and then that actually forced Canada to do something? Well, that's because there is actually a complaint resolution dispute process embedded within CUSMA. Check it out. All the way down in Article 31, there is the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement dispute settlement. So this actually gives them an avenue for what to do. So basically what they do is they talk and talk and talk, and if they can't come to an agreement, they establish a panel. And a panel is a bunch of people that get together and they're independent and they review the complaint, they review the response, and then they review CUSMA. And there's timelines in here. And then after that, they actually produce a report, and that tells the people what they actually have to do. This is what the United States did when it came to dairy. Now, Mark Carney has said repeatedly that these tariffs violate the agreement. Do you know what Canada hasn't done? Canada has not, as of yet, chosen to exercise Article 31.1 to actually file a dispute on the tariffs. If these were so bad, you have to ask, why? Why haven't you done this? So that the Liberals could accomplish one thing: to remain in power.